They had been sent out to spread destruction across the North Atlantic. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the German Navy's newest and quickest battlecruisers, were eager for a true confrontation, hoping to encounter a Royal Navy cruiser or perhaps even a battleship. When the lookout announced a ship ahead, tension surged through the crews. What emerged from the November fog, however, did not fit expectations. The silhouette was too high, too smooth, unmistakably civilian. It was a passenger liner, awkwardly fitted with a handful of outdated 6-inch guns. She looked almost harmless. Admiral Marshall could have wiped her away with a single broadside from his 11-inch batteries, but there was no pride in such an act. Instead, a German searchlight flashed a restrained ultimatum, ordering her to stop or be fired upon and to surrender. The officers and men aboard Scharnhorst waited, expecting the inevitable hoisting of a white flag. Moments passed. Then an orange flash burst from the liner's bow and a shell howled past the German bridge. A display of defiance that bordered on the unbelievable. The liner, HMS Rawalpindi, had chosen to fight. HMS Rawalpindi had been designed for comfort, not combat, with polished decks and dining tables dressed in white linen rather than ammunition hoists and gun lockers. Built in 1925 for the an Oriental Steam Navigation Company, the 16,697-ton ship served the Britain to India route until August 1939, when the Admiralty took her over and hurriedly converted her by mounting 8 aging 6-inch guns and 2 3-inch anti-aircraft weapons onto an unprotected hull. What emerged was an armed merchant cruiser in title and intention, though her soul remained that of a liner. She was commissioned on September 19, 1939, crewed largely by reservists and merchant sailors. Her commanding officer was Captain Edward Coverley Kennedy, 60 years old, called back from retirement, bringing decades of experience and a deeply rooted sense of obligation that would soon face its ultimate trial. Beneath the added guns, nothing fundamental had changed. She could make about 17 knots, carried no armor, and relied on weapons whose origins dated back to the First World War. Assigned to the Northern Patrol, she operated in a bleak expanse between Iceland, the Faroes, and Scotland, where armed merchant cruisers and light warships watched for enemy raiders slipping toward Atlantic trade routes. Her role was to give warning, not to fight. These vessels were temporary solutions. They were slower than modern capital ships, lacked advanced fire control, and their thin hulls could not withstand anything larger than a destroyer. Orders were explicit. If a patrol ship encountered a German cruiser or pocket battleship, it was to observe, report, and trail the enemy. Not engaged. Yet, in the anxious early months of the war, even imperfect measures were better than none. The Admiralty needed ships at sea to stretch the blockade and force German raiders to expose themselves. That logic sent Rawalpindi north in October, where she quickly proved useful by stopping neutral vessels and reporting a German tanker scuttled in the Denmark Strait. Such detailed signals, however, carried risks, as they could also reveal a ship's location to German codebreakers who were already listening. Most of Rawalpindi's crew were reservists. Merchant seamen suddenly turned into gunners, stokers whose last experience of war dated back to 1918, and young sailors with barely weeks of training. Between boarding inspections, they chipped ice from fittings, fixed, frozen equipment, and passed the time talking about home. In the evenings, cocoa and cigarettes offered small comfort in the wardroom. Captain Kennedy maintained a calm but strict routine, insisting on proper naval discipline and appearance even in the bitter cold. He reminded his officers that order and routine were what distinguished a warship from a helpless target. By November, the North Atlantic had become brutally cold. Spray froze solid on railings. Daylight dwindled, and dense fog banks formed like walls across the sea. Through that gray world, moved a former peacetime liner, now painted for war. Rawalpindi continued her lonely patrol as the wider naval picture shifted. Deutschland had raided earlier in the autumn before mechanical trouble forced her back. Admiral Grafspee was active in the South Atlantic to distract British forces and threaten commerce. Berlin dispatched Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, 26,000-ton sister ships armed with 9 11-inch guns each and capable of speeds exceeding 30 knots. In reality, their displacement was closer to 32,000 tons, making them formidable opponents for almost any ship afloat. Grand Admiral Eric Redder's orders were clear. Provoke a response from the British home fleet to ease pressure on Grafspee and destroy any isolated British patrol units encountered. For months, these two ships had been the pride of the Kriegsmarine, symbolizing the revival of German naval power after years of treaty restrictions. Fast, powerful, and built to endure harsh northern waters. They were designed to prey on merchant traffic and escape stronger enemies. Officially, they were not battleships, but a new hybrid type capable of overwhelming weaker ships while avoiding superior ones. Their mission carried political weight as well as military purpose. Hitler wanted proof that his rebuilt navy could intimidate British sea lanes. Redder needed a victory to demonstrate that Germany could still challenge Britain's maritime dominance at a time when submarines had not yet taken center stage. The crews aboard Scharnhorst understood this well. They were eager to test both their ship and themselves against whatever the North Atlantic presented. Vice Admiral Wilhelm Marschall sailed from Wilhelmshaven on November 21, 1939. Light cruisers and destroyers screened the force, until bad weather allowed the heavy ships to slip through alone. The plan was to pass through the ice, Faroes Gap, threaten Atlantic shipping, and force the Royal Navy to redeploy. British patrols were known to be thin and uneven, and speed, combined with weather, favored a rapid thrust, followed by withdrawal. Rawalpindi's third patrol placed her directly in the path where German plans and British routines overlapped. She had already transmitted reports in October, including the discovery of the scuttled tanker Gunnenheim, messages that almost certainly reached German command. She had also been active in stopping neutral vessels. On November 23, conditions were classic North Atlantic winter. The sun barely lifted above the horizon. Fog crept along the port side. Icebergs drifted like pale cliffs, and visibility shifted constantly as twilight approached. The Northern Patrol served a purpose, but it also had a fatal weakness the Germans intended to exploit. These improvised cruisers could neither outrun nor withstand a battlecruiser for more than moments. At about 3:30 in the afternoon on November 23, southeast of Iceland, between that island and the Faroes, the lookout in Rawalpindi's forward crow's nest raised the alarm. Two shapes appeared on the horizon, masts and superstructures barely visible. The sea lay calm but bitterly cold, fog lingering to port, icebergs sliding past like ghosts. Captain Kennedy lifted his binoculars and studied the outlines. At first he thought of Deutschland, the very threat they had been warned about. He acted without hesitation. Action stations were ordered and a contact report sent. The wireless operator transmitted the most critical message of all: an enemy sighting with position, followed by Kennedy's decisive words that he was engaging. That signal reached British command, but it was also intercepted by German listeners who could follow positions almost immediately. One sentence alerted London to move heavy units and simultaneously told Marshall that his presence had been detected. Kennedy tried to use the environment to his advantage. He turned sharply toward the fog and ordered smoke floats deployed. Thick black smoke poured from the funnel as the engines were pushed hard. But the floats malfunctioned in the cold and the fog failed to fully conceal the ship. He then swung toward starboard, aiming to use a distant iceberg as cover. In such conditions, even a liner could hide behind ice like a headland, but he needed time and distance. The approaching ships denied him both. They closed rapidly, far faster than any merchant vessel, cutting off his escape. A bright point of light flashed from the horizon as a German searchlight signaled an order to stop transmitting. A warning shot followed, throwing up a towering column of water ahead of Rawalpindi. For a brief moment, some aboard wondered if a friendly cruiser had mistaken them for an enemy. That hope vanished when a midshipman confirmed the truth. There were two warships, not one, and they were Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, advancing from either side. Kennedy stood on the bridge, knowing his ship could neither flee nor hide. His duty was to protect his crew while delaying the enemy and continuing to report. He refused the surrendered demand, kept the transmitter active, ordered the decks cleared, and prepared to fight. He turned to his chief engineer and spoke. With a calm finality that seemed striking in such an elderly and fragile man, he said they would fight both ships, that they would be sunk, and that would be the end. He shook the engineer's hand and gave the order to clear for action. Even then, the German battlecruisers hesitated, offering this hopelessly outmatched ship another chance to surrender and save lives. At about 3:45, Rawalpindi opened fire. Her old 6-inch guns roared at extreme range against modern, director-controlled batteries. It should have been nothing more than a gesture, yet the first salvo struck home. Shells burst against Scharnhorst's hull in a dramatic display of resistance. One hit exploded on the quarterdeck, cutting a signal lamp and wounding a single German sailor. It was insignificant damage to a giant, but it shocked the German officers who had offered mercy twice. Near misses were even reported close to Gneisenau. On Scharnhorst, Captain Kurt Hoffmann could scarcely believe the audacity. He had tried to spare lives, and now, a converted civilian ship armed with a few outdated guns was attempting to fight two of the most advanced warships afloat. A mix of respect and grim certainty filled the gunnery tower. The tiny flashes from the liner's guns looked almost laughable against the distant horizon, like match sparks flickering over a cold steel sea. Yet those flashes were drawing nearer, and when one burst against Scharnhorst's armor, the impact sent a jolt through the bridge. Officers murmured in stunned disbelief. Captain Hoffmann paused before giving the order to fire back. Destroying an enemy warship was one thing, but wiping out a relic of peacetime crowded with reservists and former civilians was another. Some on the bridge argued for restraint, suggesting the British vessel be given one last chance to lower her flag. The Admiral's signal ended the hesitation. War left no room for mercy. The action would be short, but it was meant to send a message to any Allied ship that might witness it. The imbalance was undeniable. Between them, the two German battlecruisers carried 18 11-inch guns, overwhelming force when a single ship could have ripped the liner's unarmored hull apart. The distance closed to roughly 4 miles, dangerously close for about. The first German salvo straddled the target, then struck with crushing effect. Heavy shells tore into the boat deck and bridge. The wireless room was destroyed, silencing further transmissions. Kennedy survived the initial blow. Flames raced along the decks and climbed into the superstructure. Electrical power failed. Central command ceased to function. With systems down, ammunition parties formed human chains, hauling 6-inch shells by hand from the magazines, while others flooded compartments to keep cordite from detonating. Below, petty officers opened valves to deliberately drown a magazine. 3 11-inch shells hit the ship wiping out the bridge, demolishing the main wireless office, and cutting all power to the fire control systems. Above decks, Chief Petty Officer Humpher took charge locally, keeping the remaining guns firing independently. What had started as a report to London turned into an act of sheer determination. The aim was simple now: keep the guns operating and the fires contained, and continue firing at an enemy whose reach and firepower dwarfed their own. Just as importantly, the engagement fixed the German ships in place long enough for the North Atlantic patrols to react. Gneisenau moved in from the opposite side and added her own barrage. Rawalpindi was trapped in a lethal crossfire. A concentration of heavy shells destroyed the main director and forward control positions. One gun after another fell silent as mounts were smashed apart. Still, firing continued. One gunner later recalled managing 3 rounds while shells crashed around him. Another survivor described a single man loading and firing a 6-inch gun alone after the rest of his crew had been killed. When the gun jammed and he turned for help, no one was left alive. The lights failed completely. Steam and smoke choked the interior. In the engine rooms and boiler spaces, men worked until there was nothing left to save. The sight was horrific. A liner ablaze from bow to stern, isolated guns still flashing, while 2 massive gray warships battered her relentlessly. On deck, conditions were almost beyond description. Cordite cases and shells were thrown overboard to prevent explosions. Kennedy moved through the chaos, directing what little could still be coordinated without communications and with too few surviving hands. He even attempted to rig smoke aft in a final effort to gain some concealment. By around 4 o'clock, Rawalpindi was effectively finished. Fire consumed her length. The captain's luck ended near the stern, where a shell burst killed him as he organized abandonment. The order to leave ship spread by shouted word of mouth. Then the magazines spoke for themselves. An 11-inch shell penetrated a forward magazine that had not been flooded. The explosion split the ship apart. Debris and fire shot into the air. One remaining gun fired a last wild round skyward, almost reflexively, and then fell silent. From first shot to destruction, the battle lasted little more than 15 minutes. Operationally, the objective had already been achieved. A sighting report had gone out. 2 German capital ships had been held in action long enough to draw British forces rushing toward the area. Tactically, it was devastation. Strategically, it cost the Germans far more than their casualty lists suggested. Their cover was blown. The breakout was identified. The home fleet was on the move. Fire forced men into the freezing sea. Lifeboats were lowered, many dangerously overloaded. One boat carrying about 40 wounded and stunned sailors capsized during lowering, throwing everyone straight into the North Atlantic. In such water, survival was counted in minutes. Small groups clung to wreckage. One account describes 4 men gripping an overturned boat, 3 losing their hold, while one pressed himself against the curved hull until his strength failed and the cold numbed his grip. When rescuers later found him, he was frozen to the boat and had to be pried free. Scharnhorst circled briefly and then ceased fire. Old maritime customs still carried weight. With the enemy ship burning and broken, Captain Hoffman slowed and prepared to offer rescue. Searchlights swept the dark water as night fell and wind whipped up spray. British survivors shouted curses. German voices called back with grim humor about the cold and promises of hot tea. In one half-flooded boat sat about 10 men, including leading seaman Roy Badeau, still dazed. A gunner, he had tried to drag his wounded brother toward the boats through fire, oil slicks, and freezing water until exhaustion overcame him. He lost his brother in the confusion. Reaching a partially submerged boat, he and the others were illuminated by a German light and waved toward. They tried to row closer as the sea heaved around them. At that moment, the reason Rawalpindi had fought revealed itself once more. German lookouts spotted another contact. A British cruiser was charging toward the scene. HMS Newcastle had answered the signal, sighted Gneisenau in the darkness, and even fired at long range. Unwilling to be trapped and destroyed by reinforcements, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau broke off the rescue. One German called out to the men waiting in the water that they could not stop, that a British ship was near, and wished them luck. The big engines surged ahead, their wake nearly swamping the survivors left behind. It was a harsh moment, born not of cruelty but necessity. Chivalry gave way to survival. British help arrived once the Germans withdrew. HMS Chitral, another armed merchant cruiser that had wisely stayed out of sight, crept in to search. She recovered Beddoes' boat with 10 survivors and found others. In total, British ships rescued 11 men from the sea. The Germans had taken more before leaving. Early reports guessed that 25 to 30 had been rescued by the enemy. Later accounts placed the number at 37, including men like Scottish gunner Robert McVeigh, who spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. Of roughly 276 to 300 aboard Rawalpindi, about 238 died with the ship, and around 48 survived. Rawalpindi's signals set entire fleets in motion. Initially believing the contact to be Deutschland, Admiral Forbes cast a wide net. Battleships Nelson and Rodney, the battlecruiser Hood, and numerous cruisers and destroyers spread out to block what was thought to be a dash toward the Norwegian Sea. The German heavy units were not where the British expected. They were exactly where Rawalpindi had seen them, already turning back for home as a storm built. Newcastle and Delhi held contact for a time, but darkness and worsening weather favored escape. Without airborne radar and with winter night closing in, the Royal Navy lost them. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau returned to Germany unharmed, their mission abandoned. That outcome forms the strategic core of the story. Rawalpindi was destroyed in a battle many later argued should never have happened. What she achieved was summed up simply by leading seaman Beddoes, who later said that the sacrifice forced the raiders to turn back. At home, the story spread rapidly. Newspapers carried survivor accounts within days. 10 men, hurriedly issued uniforms, stood on Horse Guards parade to hear Admiral Sir Charles Little tell them they had upheld the Navy's traditions. Crowds cheered them spontaneously. It was late November 1939. On land, the phony war felt like tense waiting. At sea, the war already felt real. A converted liner standing her ground, reporting contact, firing first, and fighting to destruction gave Britain a symbol of resolve for the dark months ahead. Kennedy did not receive the Victoria Cross. The standards were strict, and it was early in the war. He was mentioned in dispatches. History granted him another form of recognition. His final words on the bridge became a line repeated in memoirs and retellings, less a boast than a statement of character. In every version, there is the calm certainty of a man who weighed the odds and chose to fight anyway. The Royal Navy made use of such stories, and so did the nation. Within weeks, patrol orders were tightened, and aircraft began reinforcing surface watches around Iceland. In Germany, the incident was handled carefully. Kriegsmarine statements praised Kennedy's bravery even as they celebrated victory. Within naval circles, there was quiet discomfort over how long it took to modern battlecruisers to silence a converted liner. In Britain, the event took on a different meaning. Films, newsreels, and recruiting posters invoked the name Rawalpindi as proof that the old naval spirit endured. The wreck of Rawalpindi rests at 63 degrees, 40 minutes north and 12 degrees 31 minutes west. A designated war grave in the deep North Atlantic, 238 men went down with her, including her captain. The loss echoed immediately back in Britain, a country hungry for heroes during the phony war. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, reported the sinking to Parliament and declared that Captain Kennedy's decision to fight against hopeless odds upheld the highest traditions of the Royal Navy. The ship's story grew beyond a footnote. Her end foreshadowed the vast struggle to come. For the Kriegsmarine, the sortie was a tactical success, but a strategic failure. Destroying the armed merchant cruiser cost time and surprise, forcing Admiral Marshall to abandon the Atlantic raid and return to Germany. Under threat from the full weight of the British home fleet, the primary goal of easing pressure on Admiral Grafspee failed. In the aftermath, the Admiralty reassessed the extreme vulnerability of armed merchant cruisers. Orders were reinforced that such ships were observers, not fighters, and their role was strictly to report and withdraw. To avoid a repeat of the disaster, the Northern Patrol was strengthened with heavy cruisers and expanded air patrols from the Orkney Islands. Rawalpindi's stand marked the opening chapter of the long battle for the North Atlantic, a struggle in which merchant crews, escorts, and converted liners would stand between Britain and starvation. Kennedy's son, Ludovic himself, a naval officer who served on destroyers during the war, later carried his father's name into public life as a respected writer and broadcaster. In his memoirs, he often returned to Rawalpindi's story, reflecting on the harsh sense of duty that led his father to a choice he saw as noble, yet military.